You can't control everything, but this still shapes your life. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. Deuteronomy 30:19, KJV. Why does life feel heavy even when you're only trying to do one small thing right? Not because the task itself is complicated, not because you suddenly became incapable or unfocused, but because moments like that are rarely about the task alone. They reveal something deeper that has been building quietly over time. You stand there facing a simple responsibility, and yet your body hesitates. Your energy feels thinner than it used to. Your mind resists in ways you can't quite explain, and for a brief moment you wonder why something so ordinary now carries so much weight. This isn't about laziness. It isn't about weakness. It's about what happens after years of living inside limits you didn't choose. Most of adult life is shaped by these quiet boundaries. You don't choose the pace at which answers arrive. You don't choose how long uncertainty lingers. You don't choose how other people respond or how quickly circumstances change. Over time, these constraints accumulate. They don't announce themselves loudly, but they subtly shape how you move through your days, how you make decisions, and how much energy you have left for even the smallest efforts. As the years pass, many people come to a silent realization. There are far more things you cannot control than things you can. And while this truth is honest, it carries a hidden risk. When attention stays fixed on what lies outside your control, it becomes easy to overlook what still remains within it. Limitation slowly begins to feel like helplessness. Small choices start to seem insignificant, and without realizing it, people stop engaging fully with the life they are actually living. What makes this especially difficult is the way we are taught to think about change. We're often led to believe that life only shifts when big things move, when circumstances finally change, when clarity arrives. So when those things don't happen, people assume nothing meaningful can happen at all. They wait, they delay. They tell themselves that once conditions improve, then they'll live more intentionally, more faithfully, more honestly. But life doesn't pause while we wait. Days continue. Habits form. Attention drifts. And slowly a person can move through years without feeling that their presence truly matters. Tonight is not about denying limits or pretending you have more control than you do. It's about recognizing the quiet space that still exists within them. The space where posture, attention, and response continue to shape the direction of a life. That space doesn't feel urgent or impressive, but over time, it becomes the place where meaning, resilience, and transformation begin, not in spite of limitation, but inside it. This is where many people quietly lose confidence in their own agency. Not all at once, but gradually. When effort feels heavier than it should, people begin to assume the problem is them. They tell themselves they've changed for the worse, that they're less capable, less disciplined, less resilient than they used to be. But more often than not, that interpretation is incomplete. What's really happening is that life has narrowed in ways they didn't anticipate, and no one taught them how to live wisely inside narrowing spaces. There is a strange tension that develops when you're doing your best within limits that refuse to move. You're not refusing responsibility. You're not disengaged. You're trying to do what's right, what's necessary, what's faithful. And yet the weight remains. That tension can quietly turn into self-criticism. People begin to judge themselves for feeling tired, for hesitating, for needing more effort to do less. They assume strength should feel lighter than this. But strength that operates inside constraint always feels heavier than strength expressed in freedom. What rarely gets acknowledged is that limitation demands a different kind of energy. It requires discernment instead of force, attention instead of momentum, patience instead of urgency. And when people keep applying the same expectations they had in seasons of expansion, they exhaust themselves unnecessarily. They try to push when the season calls for alignment. They try to solve when the moment requires steadiness. Over time, this mismatch between expectation and reality creates frustration that doesn't have a clear target. This is why so many people feel restless without knowing why. Not because they want more than they should, but because they sense that something about how they are engaging with life no longer fits. The strategies that once worked don't work the same way. The motivations that once carried them forward now feel thin. And instead of recognizing this as a signal to adjust posture, people interpret it as failure. They assume something has gone wrong internally, when in reality, something is asking to be reoriented. Life doesn't only test what you can endure, it tests how you respond when endurance becomes your primary task. It asks whether you will disengage, harden, or remain attentive. Whether you will treat limitation as a verdict, or as a context within which character, wisdom, and clarity can still form. These questions don't arrive dramatically. They surface quietly, in ordinary moments, when doing one small thing right feels heavier than it should. Tonight is not asking you to override that heaviness. It's asking you to understand it, to see it not as a sign that you're failing, but as evidence that you are living inside conditions that require a different way of showing up. A way that values steadiness over speed, faithfulness over force, presence over pressure. When you recognize that shift, the weight doesn't disappear, but it begins to make sense. And when something makes sense, it no longer has the same power to discourage you. If limitation is not the enemy, then the real question becomes this: where does influence actually live when circumstances refuse to move? Most people never ask that question directly. They assume influence disappears the moment control does. But influence and control are not the same thing. Control forces outcomes. Influence shapes direction. And direction, sustained over time, quietly determines where a life ends up. This is why two people can live under nearly identical conditions and yet experience life very differently. Same responsibilities, same constraints, same unanswered questions. One slowly becomes bitter, rigid, and disengaged. The other becomes grounded, discerning, and internally free. The difference is not intelligence, luck, or even opportunity. It is how each person learns to operate inside what they cannot change. One resists the limits and exhausts themselves fighting them. The other adjusts posture and begins to work with the reality that exists instead of the one they wish would arrive. What draws people into discouragement is not the presence of limits, but the belief that limits make effort meaningless. When results are delayed, people start asking, "What's the point?" And once that question takes root, attention drifts, integrity weakens. Small responsibilities begin to feel optional rather than formative, not because people stop caring, but because they don't see a clear connection between what they do today and what their life might become tomorrow. Without that connection, motivation slowly dissolves. But life is rarely shaped by dramatic breakthroughs. It is shaped by orientation, by the way a person consistently responds to pressure, delay, and uncertainty, by what they choose to uphold when outcomes remain unclear. This is where influence quietly operates, not in changing the whole structure of a season, but in shaping the internal environment within it. Over time, that internal environment becomes the lens through which everything else is experienced. Consider how often people underestimate the long-term effect of small, repeated decisions. Where attention goes when nothing urgent demands it. How they speak to themselves when effort feels heavy. Whether they remain honest when cutting corners would go unnoticed. Whether they continue practicing what is right even when it no longer feels rewarded. These moments don't feel decisive in the moment, but they accumulate. Slowly, almost invisibly, they begin to bend the direction of a life. This is why meaningful change often begins quietly, not with clarity, but with consistency, not with certainty, but with steadiness. People don't wake up one day transformed. They wake up one day realizing that their internal posture has shifted, and life no longer feels the same from the inside out. The season may not have changed, but the way they inhabit it has. And that difference is not psychological optimism. It is lived wisdom. Faith in this sense is not about waiting passively for circumstances to improve. It is about remaining aligned with what is true, right, and necessary even when improvement is slow or invisible. It is the choice to live responsibly inside ambiguity without demanding immediate payoff. That kind of faith doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. But over time, it creates a kind of inner stability that external change alone could never provide. What begins to emerge here is a different understanding of progress. Progress is no longer measured by how quickly things resolve, but by how faithfully a person shows up within what remains unresolved. This reframes effort. It restores meaning to small actions. It reconnects daily choices to long-term formation. And once that connection is restored, discouragement loses some of its grip. Not because life becomes easier, but because effort becomes purposeful again. This is the quiet shift many people are standing on the edge of without realizing it. They are not waiting for life to open up completely. They are learning how to live wisely inside what has already been given, and when that realization begins to settle, something changes. The weight doesn't vanish, but it no longer feels pointless. It begins to feel formative. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. What most people don't realize is that the longing they feel in seasons like this is not a demand for escape. It's a desire for coherence, a need for life to make sense again from the inside. When effort feels heavy and results stay distant, the soul isn't asking for everything to change at once. It's asking for assurance that what it's doing still matters, that the energy being spent is shaping something real, even if it can't be measured yet. This is why people grow restless when they remain too long in unresolved seasons. Not because they lack patience, but because they lack a framework that explains how to live meaningfully without visible progress. Without that framework, every small action begins to feel disconnected. Days blur together. Discipline feels hollow. Faith starts to feel abstract. And slowly, people begin to disengage, not outwardly, but internally. They do what's required, but without presence. They show up, but without expectation. And that kind of living quietly drains joy. What restores engagement is not sudden clarity, but a renewed sense of participation. The realization that even when outcomes are delayed, formation is still happening. That who you are becoming is being shaped in the very places where nothing seems to be moving. This reframes waiting. It transforms it from a passive state into an active posture. Waiting is no longer something you endure until life begins again. It becomes the space where attentiveness, integrity, and maturity quietly take root. At this point, something subtle but important shifts. People stop asking only, "When will this end?" and begin asking, "How am I living while it continues?" That question changes everything. It brings agency back into reach. It reconnects daily choices to long-term identity. It allows a person to feel involved in their own life again, even without control over outcomes. And that sense of involvement is what sustains people over long stretches of uncertainty. This is also where desire begins to clarify. Not the desire for relief, but the desire for alignment. The desire to live in a way that feels internally honest, even when externally unresolved. People begin to want a steadiness that isn't dependent on circumstances, a clarity that doesn't disappear when answers are delayed, a way of moving through life that feels grounded rather than reactive. That desire is not escapism, it is maturity forming. What many people are actually longing for is not a different life, but a different relationship with the life they have. They want to stop feeling fragmented. They want their effort to feel anchored. They want their days to carry meaning beyond survival. And when they realize that this is possible, not through force but through posture, something softens. The pressure to fix everything eases. The urgency to rush clarity diminishes. In its place, a quieter determination begins to form. This determination doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't feel like motivation in the usual sense. It feels more like resolve, a willingness to stay present, to act with intention, to keep choosing what is right and necessary, even when progress feels slow. Over time, that resolve becomes stabilizing. It creates an inner consistency that external change alone can't provide. And that consistency becomes the foundation for whatever comes next. By the time people reach this point, they are no longer just listening out of curiosity. They are listening because something in them recognizes the truth of what's being named. They sense that this way of engaging with life, attentive, responsible, steady, is what they've been missing. Not because life has been unfair, but because no one taught them how to live well inside limitation. And once that recognition settles, desire is no longer abstract. It becomes personal. It becomes practical. It prepares the ground for action. At this stage, desire no longer sounds like ambition. It doesn't feel loud or urgent. It feels quieter than that, more grounded. What begins to form is not the desire to escape your life, but the desire to inhabit it differently. To stop feeling like your days are something you endure, and start experiencing them as something you are actively participating in, even when circumstances remain unchanged. Many people misunderstand this desire at first. They assume wanting steadiness means settling, that choosing alignment over urgency means giving up on growth. But the opposite is true. This kind of desire is not passive. It is deeply intentional. It is the desire to live with coherence, where your actions, values, and inner posture are no longer at odds with one another. Where effort no longer feels wasted simply because results are delayed. There is a moment when people begin to recognize that the exhaustion they feel is not coming from responsibility itself, but from carrying responsibility without meaning. Doing things without understanding how they connect to who they are becoming. Once that connection is restored, energy shifts. Not dramatically, but sustainably. Effort begins to feel anchored again. Not because life gets easier, but because it starts to feel purposeful. This is where examples from ordinary life suddenly become illuminating. Consider two people who both show up every day to the same demanding routine, same constraints, same lack of recognition, same unanswered questions. One feels slowly depleted, the other feels quietly formed. The difference is not circumstance, it is interpretation. One sees their actions as temporary survival until something better arrives. The other understands their actions as shaping endurance, character, and attentiveness right now. Over time, that difference compounds. This is why the philosopher William James once observed that the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. That statement is not about positive thinking. It is about orientation, about recognizing that while you may not control events, you do participate in how those events are metabolized within you. That participation shapes your internal environment, and your internal environment, over time, shapes the quality of your life. As this realization deepens, desire becomes more specific. People don't just want relief anymore. They want reliability within themselves. They want to trust their own responses again. To know that even when things feel uncertain, they are living in a way that aligns with what they believe is right and necessary. That trust doesn't come from certainty about the future. It comes from consistency in the present. This is also where faith, for many, shifts from abstraction to practice. Faith is no longer something reserved for moments of clarity or breakthrough. It becomes something lived quietly in repetition. In choosing patience when frustration would be easier. In choosing integrity when shortcuts would go unnoticed. In choosing presence when disengagement would numb the discomfort. These choices don't remove pressure, but they transform how pressure is carried. A helpful way to understand this is through a simple image. Think of a compass rather than a map. A map requires full visibility. It assumes you know where you are and where you're going. A compass does not. It only requires orientation, direction, not detail. Many people are exhausted because they are waiting for a map in a season that only offers a compass. Once they accept orientation as enough, movement becomes possible again. Not fast, but true. This desire for orientation explains why people feel drawn to a steadier way of living even when excitement is absent. They want their lives to feel internally consistent. They want their values to show up in their behavior, not just in their intentions. They want to stop negotiating with themselves at every small decision. And they want to know that when they look back on this season, it will not feel empty or wasted, even if it was difficult. What is forming here is a desire for faithfulness over feeling, for responsibility without pressure, for a way of living that does not depend on constant reassurance or visible progress. This desire doesn't reject hope. It refines it. Hope becomes less about what will happen next, and more about who you are becoming right now. By the time people reach this point, they are no longer asking whether this approach works in theory. They are asking whether they are willing to live this way in practice, whether they are willing to invest in small, faithful actions without demanding immediate return, whether they trust that formation is happening even when evidence is subtle. And that question, quiet, honest, personal, is where desire fully takes shape. It prepares the ground for action, not as pressure, but as invitation. At this point, desire begins to press gently but persistently, not with urgency but with clarity. People start to sense that remaining where they are internally will require just as much energy as changing how they live. That continuing on autopilot is no longer neutral. It is a choice, one that slowly shapes a life without intention. And once that realization settles, neutrality disappears. There is no longer a comfortable middle ground between drifting and deciding. What makes this moment significant is that nothing external has changed yet. Circumstances remain the same. Answers are still incomplete. Limits are still present. And yet something internal has shifted. People begin to see that waiting for life to feel different before living differently is no longer sustainable. They recognize that formation is already happening, whether they participate consciously or not. The only real question left is what kind of formation they are allowing. This is where many people hesitate, not because they disagree with what they're hearing, but because they sense the responsibility implied. Choosing a steadier posture means giving up certain illusions. The illusion that clarity will arrive first. The illusion that motivation will always be available. The illusion that growth must feel energizing to be real. Letting go of those expectations can feel like loss. But what is gained in return is something far more stabilizing: agency without pressure. Here, desire becomes less about wanting a better future and more about wanting integrity in the present. People begin to care less about whether their efforts are noticed and more about whether they are aligned. They start to value consistency over intensity, faithfulness over emotional certainty. They realize that a life does not drift into meaning. It is shaped by repeated choices to show up attentively, especially when showing up feels ordinary or unseen. A helpful way to understand this shift is to notice how people speak about their days. Before, they describe life as something happening to them. After this shift, they begin to describe how they are responding within it. The language changes subtly. Responsibility re-enters the picture, not as burden, but as grounding. Life feels less chaotic not because it has become simpler, but because their internal posture has become more coherent. This is also the point where excuses begin to lose their power, not because they were dishonest, but because they no longer explain enough. People stop saying, "I'll start when things settle," because they see that things rarely settle first. They stop saying, "I need to feel ready," because they realize readiness often follows action, not the other way around. What remains is a quieter, more honest question. Am I willing to live this way even if nothing changes right away? That question brings people to the edge of decision. Not a dramatic vow, not a public declaration, just a private resolve. A willingness to stop postponing participation in their own life, to take responsibility for what is still theirs to choose, attention, posture, response, and to release what never was. This resolve doesn't feel like excitement, it feels like steadiness, like something clicking into place internally. By now, desire is no longer abstract, it is embodied. People can feel the difference between drifting and deciding, between surviving the days and stewarding them. They sense that while they cannot control outcomes, they can choose how they carry the weight of living. And that choice, repeated over time, will shape the quality of their inner life regardless of external results. This is the threshold many people reach but rarely name, the moment where life quietly asks, not what you want to happen next, but how you intend to live while you wait. It is not a demand, it is an invitation. An invitation to step into a way of living that is steadier, more honest, and less dependent on circumstances. Accepting that invitation does not guarantee ease, but it does guarantee coherence. And coherence over time becomes its own form of peace. At this point, the desire to live intentionally inside limitation becomes stronger than the desire to remain comfortable inside delay. And when that happens, action no longer feels forced. It feels inevitable. Not because everything is clear, but because continuing as before no longer fits who you are becoming. That is how quiet decisions are made. Not in moments of pressure, but in moments of recognition. And once recognition arrives, the next step is no longer a question of motivation. It is simply a matter of choice. Action at this stage is not about changing your life. It's about changing how you show up inside it. Many people hear the word action and immediately feel pressure, as if something big, visible, or decisive is required. But that assumption is exactly what keeps people stuck. When action is framed as dramatic change, it becomes overwhelming. When it's framed as participation, it becomes possible. The first action is not external, it's internal alignment. It's the decision to stop postponing presence until conditions improve, to stop treating today as a placeholder for a future that hasn't arrived yet. This action doesn't ask you to do more. It asks you to do what you're already doing with attention instead of autopilot. To recognize that your inner posture matters even when outcomes remain unchanged. Most people underestimate how often they disengage from their own lives in small ways. They rush through tasks without awareness. They numb discomfort instead of naming it. They distract themselves whenever effort feels heavy. None of this is wrong. It's understandable. But over time, it creates distance. From purpose, from agency, from meaning. Action begins when you gently reverse that pattern. When you choose to remain present in moments where disengagement would be easier, this might look unremarkable. Choosing to complete a responsibility without resentment, pausing before reacting defensively, giving full attention to one task instead of scattering it across many. These are not productivity techniques. They are acts of stewardship. They signal to yourself that your participation matters, even when recognition is absent and results are delayed. The reason this matters is simple. What you consistently pay attention to becomes what shapes you. Attention trains the nervous system. It informs identity. It determines whether effort feels like depletion or formation. When you act with awareness, even briefly, you interrupt the sense of drift that so many people feel. You remind yourself that while you cannot command outcomes, you are not powerless within the process. This first action also involves releasing a common habit, waiting for motivation before engagement. Motivation is unreliable in constrained seasons. It rises and falls based on energy, mood, and circumstance. If engagement depends on motivation, it will remain inconsistent. Action, in this sense, is the choice to engage because it aligns with who you want to become, not because it feels energizing in the moment. There is a quiet dignity in this kind of action. It does not announce itself. It does not seek validation. But it builds something durable. Over time, it restores trust, not in circumstances, but in yourself. You begin to see that you can live intentionally even when life feels narrow. That your days are not being wasted simply because they are repetitive. That formation is happening whether or not you feel inspired. This action does not require optimism. It does not require certainty. It only requires honesty. An honest acknowledgement of where you are, paired with a willingness to show up fully within it. That combination is rare, and it is powerful. It turns waiting into participation. It turns limitation into context rather than verdict. As this practice settles, something subtle shifts. Effort no longer feels like resistance against reality. It feels like cooperation with it. You stop measuring your days only by progress and begin measuring them by presence. And while that may sound small, it changes how weight is carried. Life may remain heavy, but it no longer feels pointless. This is the foundation of action in constrained seasons. Not speed, not visibility, not outcome, but attentiveness. The willingness to be fully present in what you are already doing, without demanding that it feel lighter than it is. This is not resignation. It is engagement at a deeper level, and it prepares you for every other action that follows. Once this shift begins, additional actions become possible, not because life has changed, but because you have re-entered it consciously. That is where momentum actually starts, quietly, reliably, from the inside out. Once you understand that action begins with presence, the next question becomes practical. What does this actually look like in a normal day? Not an ideal day, not a productive day, a real one. A day where energy fluctuates, motivation comes and goes, and responsibilities don't wait for clarity. Action, at this level, is not about redesigning your life. It's about choosing 1 or 2 points of integrity inside the day and honoring them consistently. The second action is choosing one small thing to do fully, instead of many things partially. Most people live scattered. Their attention is divided before the day even begins. They think about what's next while doing what's now. They rush through tasks just to get past them. This fragmentation makes everything feel heavier than it needs to be. When attention is split, effort multiplies. But when attention is gathered, effort stabilizes. So action here is simple. Select one responsibility, just one, and decide in advance to do it with full presence. Not perfectly, just attentively. That might mean finishing a task without checking your phone, listening to someone without planning your response, completing something ordinary without resentment or mental escape. This does not change your workload, but it changes your experience of it. Over time, these moments of gathered attention begin to retrain the nervous system. Life feels less chaotic, not because there is less to do, but because you are no longer scattered within it. Another small but powerful action is choosing how you speak to yourself when effort feels heavy. Most people don't notice how quickly their internal language turns critical in constrained seasons. I should be further along. This shouldn't be this hard. Something must be wrong with me. These thoughts feel automatic, but they are not neutral. They drain energy and reinforce helplessness. Action here is noticing the moment this language appears and choosing to interrupt it. Not with forced positivity, but with accuracy. Accuracy sounds like this. This is hard because I'm carrying a lot. Or, this feels heavy because I'm living inside limits. Or simply, I'm allowed to take this one step at a time. This kind of self-talk doesn't remove difficulty, but it removes unnecessary friction. It allows effort to remain connected to dignity instead of shame. Over time, this shift alone can significantly change how sustainable your days feel. A third action involves reclaiming one small decision you've been avoiding. Not a major life choice, just a minor one you've postponed because it feels easier to delay than to decide. Something that sits quietly in the background, draining attention without resolution. Choosing to address it, even imperfectly, restores a sense of agency that many people don't realize they've lost. Decision-making, when practiced at a small scale, rebuilds confidence far more effectively than waiting for big certainty. This action is not about making the right decision. It's about making a decision and learning to stand by it. To experience yourself as someone who can choose and follow through, even when outcomes are modest. That experience accumulates. It strengthens internal trust. And internal trust is essential in seasons where external stability is limited. It's important to notice that none of these actions require extra time, resources, or motivation. They only require willingness. Willingness to stay present. Willingness to speak accurately instead of critically. Willingness to choose instead of drift. These actions don't add pressure to your life. They remove the subtle pressure of disengagement that makes everything feel heavier than it needs to be. Over time, practicing these small actions creates rhythm. Days begin to feel less chaotic, even if they remain full. Effort feels more contained. Attention feels more grounded. And while nothing dramatic may change externally, something important changes internally. You begin to experience yourself as an active participant again, rather than a passive observer of your own life. This is how action becomes sustainable. Not by demanding more from yourself, but by reconnecting with what you are already capable of doing today. When action is scaled to reality, it stops feeling intimidating. It becomes a quiet companion rather than a looming expectation. and that is what allows it to be repeated. As these small choices settle into habit, they prepare the ground for deeper action, the kind that doesn't just shape days, but reshapes identity. That next level doesn't require urgency either. It requires continuity, and that is what the final action will address. The final action is not about adding anything new to your life. It's about changing the way you relate to repetition. Most people fail to sustain change not because they lack discipline, but because they misunderstand how consistency actually works. They assume consistency requires constant motivation, emotional clarity, or visible results. When those things fade, they conclude that the practice itself has failed. But consistency was never meant to be fueled by feeling. It is meant to be supported by structure. The third action, then, is choosing a frame that allows small, faithful actions to continue even when desire fluctuates. This frame is simple, but powerful. You stop asking yourself whether you feel like showing up, and start asking whether this is who you are becoming. When action is tied to identity rather than emotion, it becomes far more stable. You no longer negotiate with yourself every day. You begin to act from coherence instead of effort. This shift matters because most of life is repetitive. The same responsibilities, the same environments, the same unresolved questions. If meaning depends on novelty, life will always feel disappointing. But when meaning is rooted in formation, repetition becomes the very place where depth is built. What you do consistently, even in small ways, teaches you who you are. And who you are becoming shapes how you experience everything else. To sustain this, it helps to release a damaging habit, evaluating each day as success or failure. That mindset turns life into a performance review. It creates pressure where none is needed. Instead, action becomes sustainable when days are treated as practice. Some days will feel attentive, others will feel scattered. That doesn't invalidate the practice. It confirms that you are human. What matters is returning. Not restarting, not correcting. Simply returning to the posture you chose. Another part of this frame is allowing progress to be quiet. Many people abandon good practices because nothing dramatic seems to happen, but internal change rarely announces itself. It shows up subtly. Less reactivity, more steadiness, quieter confidence, reduced self-criticism. These shifts are easy to overlook if you're only watching for breakthroughs. Sustaining action means learning to notice these quieter signals of formation and allowing them to count. This frame also frees you from urgency. Urgency creates intensity, but it rarely creates endurance. When people rush transformation, they burn out. When they accept formation, they stabilize. The goal is not to fix your life quickly. It is to live it honestly and attentively over time. That requires pacing. It requires permission to move slowly without feeling behind. A helpful way to hold this is to see your actions as votes rather than verdicts. Each small, attentive choice is a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. One vote does not determine everything, but over time, the accumulation does. This perspective removes pressure from individual moments while preserving the importance of consistency. You don't need to be perfect today. You only need to keep voting in the same direction. As this way of living settles, something important happens. Action stops feeling like self-improvement and starts feeling like self-trust. You trust that even when life remains constrained, you are not drifting. You are participating. You are shaping your inner life with intention, and that trust becomes stabilizing. It allows you to carry uncertainty without panic, delay without despair, and repetition without resentment. This is how a life quietly changes. Not through dramatic decisions, but through sustained alignment, through choosing presence again and again, through acting in ways that make sense even when outcomes remain unclear. Over time, this approach reshapes how you experience weight, effort, and responsibility. Life may remain demanding, but it no longer feels meaningless. The invitation here is not to do more, but to stay, to remain engaged with your own life, to treat small actions as formative rather than insignificant, to let consistency, not intensity, carry the work. When you do that, action stops being something you force. It becomes something you embody, and embodied action is what endures. This is not the end of the journey. It is the way you walk it. quietly, faithfully, with integrity. And over time, without needing to announce it, that way of living begins to shape a life that feels grounded, coherent, and deeply yours. If there is one thing to carry with you from this time together, let it be this. Your life is not paused just because it feels limited. You are not waiting on the sidelines of your own story. Even here, even now, inside repetition, uncertainty, and unfinished questions, something real is being formed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but faithfully. You may not control the season you're in. You may not see immediate results from the effort you're making, but the way you show up inside these conditions is shaping you more than you realize. Every moment of presence, every small decision to remain attentive, every choice to act with integrity instead of drifting, none of it is wasted. It's becoming part of you. Life does not suddenly become light because we understand it. It becomes livable when it makes sense from the inside, when effort feels connected to meaning, when responsibility feels grounded rather than punishing. That kind of life is built quietly, over time, by people who choose to stay engaged even when clarity is delayed. So tonight, don't measure your progress by what has changed around you. Measure it by how you are standing within it, by whether you are present instead of numb, honest instead of distracted, willing instead of withdrawn. That is enough for today. You don't need to fix your life tonight. You don't need to decide everything. You don't need to feel motivated or certain. You only need to remain where you are, awake, attentive, and willing to take the next small step when it's available. Let this not be a one-time listen. Return when the weight feels heavy again. Return when effort feels harder than it should. Return when you need to remember that even inside limits, your choices still matter. Nothing is required of you here. Just presence, and that is already enough.